I a hero?
Am I a hero?
Am I a hero?
Am I a hero?
We're here to challenge your definition of a hero.
All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of 10,000 Heroes, the podcast. Very excited again today. I will go as far to say, Encore, that you're on a roll, man. You're on fire.
Oof, thank you.
I'm loving these interviews. This is so good. This is really some of the best content I consume all week. You really spoke to me. You're speaking my love language, Shakespeare.
Yeah, I know you love the theater.
I love the theater, and maybe with your permission, I'll divulge a little personal content.
Oh, let's do it. Yeah.
So my background is theater, and my initial introduction into theater was ritual theater, and this was back in Seattle. And my mentor at that time, Dr. Tanya Pettifer Waits, was teaching a course called Ritual Poetic Drama in the African Continuum, and the type of work she modeled was very much a theater centered in purpose and centered in a sort of political activism, I guess, for lack of a better word. That much like Ava saying in this interview, that the purpose of art is to wake people up, to shine some light, and to offer some what you guys talk about is a peak experience, but to offer some platform then for discussion, which was a big part of the theater that we offered. So we do the performance, and then a big part of that was then the dialogue that continued afterwards, that we'd open up the space in the theater and have this kind of town hall style discussion where we would facilitate, but it wasn't just like Ava's saying, just a Q&A back and forth with the actors, but giving the community an opportunity to speak about these very complex and sometimes divisive issues. So I felt so affirmed and energized by some of the things Ava was saying. Then, my trajectory was then I went and trained classically at a conservatory and studied the classics, Shakespeare and Chekhov, and applied all these movement approaches and different somatic approaches to theater. And always, I never lost this urge to work with people and to work with communities. And that was always my interest and passion with theater. And that's what I ended up doing after I graduated, and what informs a lot of the work we do together in terms of facilitating a group process. And to hear her talk about the use of creativity and the use of art in this way, I want to say something. I think there's a really interesting point of commonality between your discussion with Ava and the previous episode with Abby. And something Abby said that stuck out to me was that during COVID, during pandemic, she defined it as a constraint that then made it necessary for them to innovate and for them to change and scale and change their programming in a way that they probably wouldn't have thought to, at least not maybe for another decade, if it wasn't for the pandemic. And something Ava's saying too, even from the beginning of this story that you guys start with the running of the salmon, is that this sort of challenge, or she doesn't say constraint, but it's this necessary challenge that actually births the creativity, that actually makes way for the creativity. I think this speaks, we say things similar to this a lot, where it's that, even to define it as an obstacle, we could define it as an obstacle, or we could define it as the terrain of the journey itself. And in that way, we are so much more empowered. We have so much more agency, I think, is the word that came out of one of these interviews.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's I mean, for me, that's the potential. That's the transformative potential. And she really, I have this list in my head of all the things we can do to help each other transform as we engage. And I had left off serious, like that wasn't on the list for me. Right. So it was this whole gift that she gave me during that interview. Oh yeah, theater. or even, just being in the
It
presence and part of the art in that way.
doesn't even occur to us anymore. Our relationship with it is so much based in entertainment and distraction.
Yeah.
Right? Just like binge watching some show. But that's the whole origin of theater. It's like this experience. It's like the Dionysus Festival. It's like be these 3-day events where the whole community would come together and go through something together. It was this ritual transformative process, and I love that there's people carrying that forward, and reminding us that, we, it used to, the Shakespeare plays in particular are interesting, because they've just been edited and edited down now to be something palatable. So now you can't have a modern audience sit through a 5-hour play. You do all these cuts just to make it palatable. But you'd go and you'd have like a whole day of theater, when these plays went up. They were like really like there were commitments intellectually and just to stay with it, for the audience would come and meet the actors at that level and be ready to go through something, and maybe we've lost that a little bit. Maybe there's a way to get a little bit of that back.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to make the connection with another interview from a few episodes ago with Laura. It's this idea of coming to it with not just that retail mindset, but wanting to invest something of yourself, right? Like if someone's going to do that for an entire day, it's not just channel flipping or whatever it's called. You're like, all right, I gotta show up. I gotta be here. It's going to be part of me. I'm going to change. They're going to change. We're all going to be in this together.
So much of this idea that we bring something to the table too. And so much of this idea, of the site-specific installation. In New York, there was the Punch Drunk company from London. Really, they produced a show for a number of years. Actually, they own the property now. This Sleep No More, which is based on Macbeth, if we can say that on a podcast. I don't know, but this idea that you go into the space and you don't, part of it is your own exploration. What's in this room? What's in that room? I'm like, I can go explore over here. And, they, similar, that like kidnap you from your group. That was one of their little tricks, that kidnap you, that take you off the elevator. And now your girlfriend's gone. Now you're not on that date anymore. Now you're in this room watching these people do this crazy movement thing. And then when you go and find your date, you've both had these totally different explorations and experiences. And if you went to the thing 3 nights in a row, you'd have a different experience every time, And so I love that. And I love that Ava is like really taking this, taking the spirit into the world, that it's not just sit in your chair and watch us. Like you're going to be a participant in this, and you're going to bring something to the experience.
The miracle of my experience this weekend was I saw a coho salmon leap upstream over the falls to get to its spot, which, like, there's that gap between the conceptual and the actual. It's like, I knew that, I believed that, but I was like a giddy 4-year-old. Like when it happened, I was just jumping up and down and clapping. I was just like, couldn't handle it. And then talk about a metaphor. I mean, come on, they literally are swimming upstream to go spawn and die, like a glorious leap towards death. It's like they know their purpose. They're just against all odds moving towards that purpose, even if that equals death. I was just like overcome. So that's a real thing that happens. Salmon really do that. And I got to witness it, and it just blew my mind.
Yeah, it's so powerful. It makes me think of that bit in the Bible where Jesus is like, he's like, oh, God cares about everybody. He's taking care of these little flowers. He's taking care of the birds. Like, why are you so neurotic and doubtful about your own life? Like, look at all of the magic everywhere. I get through that salmon. I'm like, oh God,
yeah,
they can do it.
And they're just pure muscle from tip to tip. Like they are using every bit of themselves. I just got so much inspiration from it. I was like on the yoga level, like economy of movement and using all of your power from tip to tip, and like nothing wasted. And then on this like sort of spiritual level, like this jubilant leap towards death is so incredible. And they're just little fish. Like, why? Also, nature. Like, why didn't they just do it a different way? Like, why is that the adaptive plan?
Yeah.
It seems so crazy.
So yeah, you had this inspiring trip. You saw the salmon. You beheld. Your eyes were like open wide. You were bared to the experience of the salmon.
It's true. It's true.
Okay. Now what I want to do, because I really want to get into talking about the grand drama that we're all involved in. This all the world's a stage, and all the men and women salmon and humans are merely players
swimming upstream.
Yeah. What kind of inspiration did this give you for your vocation, for your work?
Well, gosh, so much. I feel like the salmon inspired me, in many ways. I think on both a personal level and a professional level, like that often it feels like we're, as artists, swimming upstream and going against the current. And there's not often the experience of wind at our back or current of moving with the current, especially, I don't know, but I have a small insight through international friends who are artists that, in the US, there's not a lot of systemic support for artists. And a lot of times when we're applying for grants or whatever, unfortunately, we're in competition with each other, and there's often limited resources or the feeling of that. And I do think there's a certain amount of staying hungry and not having quite everything you need that is actually really essential for art making, both because it keeps you hungry and feeds that drive to keep going kind of against all odds, and because it sometimes supports creativity when you have to work within restraints or restrictions.
Sure.
But yeah, just the image of literally swimming upstream. And then when it reaches a particularly rough patch, this waterfall that it can't possibly swim through, that it waits in the shallows and bides its time and gathers its energy, and then makes this unbelievably impossible attempt to leap upwards through the air against the current, through the air. Fish are supposed to swim, not fly, and goes upstream against the current. And the thing is that may not make it on the first or second, or who knows how many tries. I don't study salmon, so I don't know, but that it keeps trying and till it reaches its destination. So for me, there's something about perseverance and determination, but also this practice of waiting and gathering and then using every bit of yourself to do the impossible. And every artistic event or act has that certain quality of doing the impossible. And certainly for performance artists, there's this feeling of, I don't know, like an Olympic sport or something, like we watch to see, will the high jumper like make it over the high jump? Will the actor succeed? And so something about going for it and striving against odds and using every bit of yourself from tip to tip.
Yeah, and there is this really mythic relationship, between death, rebirth, transcendence. Salmon. I'm thinking of the phoenix. I'm thinking of the salmon that spends most of its life, 3 to 5 years, depending on the species, in the salt water, eating, and then comes back to its native river where it was born to reproduce and die, knowing that, let's say, in our anthropomorphizing the salmon, it knows that. It makes this decision. It's in the salt water and it's like, all right, I'm going to do it. It stops eating. And that whole time it's swimming upstream, it's not eating, it's not focused on that. It's just using all of its reserves in this grand creative process with death as the known kind of stoplight or lamppost at the end. It's just, it knows every moment it's getting closer to its moment of apotheosis.
And if only we could do the same, to move joyfully towards death. There's so much that we do to prevent and hide and prolong. And of course, we cling close to this life. This life is beautiful and full of joy and full of riches and full of experience. And so, of course, we cling and to the things we know, and that it's the great unknown is scary, as Hamlet puts it. The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of. So he's talking about that intense fear of not knowing what's on the other side is what keeps us bound to our mortal struggles. We'd rather have those struggles we know than the undiscovered country or the unknown shore of what's beyond in the land of death. But this image of this little fish, leaping in that direction. And as you said, we're here anthropomorphizing the fish, and it instinctively knows what to do. But there's something in that is just so inspiring. And I think particularly, I personally had a number of losses in the past year, and one of them very significant and life-changing. And also in the past few years, I've had the privilege of doing this piece of art, this performance called Mother Lear, which is a 2-woman show about an aging Shakespeare scholar with dementia and her caretaker daughter. And it's inspired by, well, it's more than inspired by King Lear. It actually uses 99% text exclusively drawn from Shakespeare's King Lear, although rearranged and adapted to tell this modern story of a mother and her daughter. And in that process of doing this piece, I should say Act 1 is the performance. It's about 50 minutes long. It's these 2 women. It's very intimate, sort of towards a poor theater, just 2 women in a bag of props, and the audience is right up close, and it's very intimate. But then Act 2 is a conversation with the audience about the themes of the piece, ranging from death and dying and end-of-life care to dementia and Alzheimer's, to just broader themes of family and love, and how do we have difficult conversations with our loved ones, conversations we'd rather avoid. And those conversations, those Act 2 conversations with audience members, have truly been some of the most profound experiences of my life, and certainly artistically, where I get to witness art doing its job, where the performance really cracks people open and gives people access to these emotions and this sense of safety and willingness to share within a group of usually strangers, and to talk about these things that are, pretty taboo in our culture. We don't spend a lot of time talking about death and dying or end of life care or our fears around it or our wishes or hopes around it. And so many people are dealing with it, and everyone will at some point. Everyone loses something, someone at some point. And so it's just given me a lot of interest, really, in talking about death and talking about the process, and not just death, but the process of losing things. And how do we feel less alone and less afraid as we face those inevitable losses, be they small or large?
Yeah. Wow. So there's maybe 9 questions that I have, all in different directions. One is about kind of your history with the theater. One is about Shakespeare in general and the relevance of Shakespeare and how to get what to get out of it and how to get it and how you get it. One is about King Lear, maybe some background for our audience about King Lear. One is about Mother Lear, your story. But I'm going to start with the last one and kind of go from the top of the stack here. You said something about the job of art. What I'd like to know, not just what you think, although it's nice to know what you think, but what you feel like you've used your time as a public artist to create in terms of the job of art. Like what work have you put art towards in the past 10, 15, 20 years? And how is that related to the job of therapy, the job of psychedelics, the job of Tony Robbins, the job of emotional honesty? Like, how does it fit into these other parts of our culture?
Yeah. Well, Yummy. That's a good. How long do we have again, Encore, to talk about
as long as you
art and
want.
life and all the things? Yeah, I mean, I really feel that art is its job in large part is about waking us up to ourselves and our um, our experience. And that sounds really simple, but art can bring us into a heightened state of attention, a concentrated experience, an extraordinary experience, as in outside of the ordinary. And within the sphere of performance, or within, it ranges across artistic disciplines or medium, but within that concentrated, heightened space of the artistic event, something other can happen, something extraordinary can happen. We can go more fully into our sensory experience sometimes. This connects really back to, in terms of how I've tried to make my art do that. I get a lot of inspiration from both ancient mythology, in which, there's this sense, for example, in the Greeks, of creating the gods to better understand ourselves through them. And also through ancient ritual practices, and even specifically ritual dramas or religious dramas, such as in the Hindu mythology and in Indian culture, which is what I'm more familiar with than in other cultures. But the way in which in a ritual drama or ritual performance, truly a sacred space is created. And in fact, in those extreme kind of examples, the actor is literally venerated as a deity for the duration of the performance. And they go through all sorts of preparations and purification practices in order to do that, in order to be a channel. And I think even when we're not within that sort of religious context, that's in large part an actor's job, is to prepare their instrument to be a channel through which something can flow, hopefully truth and beauty. And that in large part, art's job is not just to reflect us back to ourselves, but help us more fully experience our senses and our sense of self in the scheme of things, our sense of connection to not just other people, but to other energies and beings. All of my work is place-based. So it's also about setting performances in natural environments in order to more fully experience that place and the play, and hopefully that there's an alchemical relationship between the play and the place that helps enhance the thematic or just physical sensory experience of that place and the content of the play. I think that I'm trying to do something that is hopefully entertaining and funny and joyful and surprising and all those wonderful things that entertainment can be along the way. But I am trying to do something that is sort of deeper than just entertainment, that does bring us into, even if it's just for a moment, a kind of those aha moments where there's that sense of colors being brighter or senses being stronger or just seeing more clearly, if only for a flash, that art can bring us into this state of heightened awareness or sense of being awake. And then in that place, that's when the extraordinary can happen, right? And it might be different for each audience member. It might happen at a different moment. It might last or not last a different amount of time. But with those moments of, I see, I feel, then what we do with it is up to us, how we apply that back into our lives. My hope is that by staging things in these kind of multi-dimensional ways where the audience is on their feet and they're moving through a performance space and things are being staged above them, behind them, below them, in the distance, that in experiencing that for the few hours of the performance, that they might be just that much more likely to practice that paying attention in their everyday life, that they might be a little bit more likely to look above them, behind them, below them as they walk from the subway to work or their car to the house or whatever. And often when we pay attention like that, we're rewarded. So when you look up in a We Players performance, you may notice a dancer or a musician or something that isn't the main focus of the scene in that instant, that is also part of the space. So you realize you're in this kind of sphere of performance, that things are happening on many levels. And when we practice that in life, just yesterday, when I looked up, I saw 2 huge bald eagles perched at the top of these 2 trees on either side of the road, standing like sentinels. And they were there And I had to look up to notice they were there. And it's so easy not to look up or not to look beyond what's immediately in front of me. So I think I'm trying to stage things in a way that inspire people to pay attention and to experience our senses, not just as something that happens to us. That perspective is not just something that happens to us, but it's something that we can participate in, that seeing itself is an act of creation or can be an act of creation. So those are some of the things. I could probably ramble on a bit longer, but those are some of the things I'm interested in and hoping to do.
Yeah, no, I love that, and it's great for me because it's not something I would have thought of. So to provide a little context, I work, I have a few different hats, but one of the hats I put on is as an executive coach, a transformational leadership coach, and that's really inspired by work I've done and experiences I had that were what we call peak experiences, these things that were just so different from the norm, and that I put all this work into integrating them and becoming a new person. Once again, it's like kind of death and rebirth cycle that I've tried to do a number of times. And when, I'm always thinking about like lists of like peak experiences to recommend to people to help them integrate, things that can really lead to transformation. And I'm always thinking about long meditation retreats, pilgrimage, travel, deprivation of various kinds, hunger, poverty, other mind altering, maybe psychedelic experiences. But the way you just described art, I mean, it really belongs on that list. And it's one of these experiences that can really turn the focus inward, where so many times we're asked to pay attention to other people or products or events or happenings. And what I heard you saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's the invitation, or I don't know if invitation, demand, the you're with good art maybe, or art that speaks to you, you cannot resist paying attention to your own experience. You're compelled to be like, oh God, this is what's happening right now. Like you said, like in a very physical level with the senses, like this is what's going on with my sensory experience right now, in a way that most of the time we're just phoning it in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even sometimes if you're so transported that you have the experience of sort of forgetting your body or some part of yourself, then there's that emergence from the experience. And then that's the moment where it's like, oh, you come back to yourself and things seem brighter, or you're more connected or more attuned, or you notice in that transition between states. I mean, you're talking about state work in a way, right? And as actors, we explore different states of being. And we also explore different emotional terrain that may not be part of our own experience yet. And that's another huge job of art is training us, teaching us about empathy, so that even though, as you were just saying, this sense of turning inwards, that art can bring us really powerfully inside ourselves and bring us closer home to ourselves, that is itself something that gives us more access to other people. I think when we're more in tune with our own emotional range and reality, truly, and that we have experiences that dissolve our boundaries or destroy or take away or even just soften some of our normal edges. Things that can get past our personality are really important, whether that's meditation or yoga or these, as you're saying, these peak experiences, of which I believe art can absolutely and pretty regularly and reliably sometimes be a way to connect with those peak experiences. That there's this, I guess I'm reaching for that connection between that deeper awareness of self, or that getting past the personality where we're not censoring or judging our experience, and then we get access to something we might not otherwise have access to. And that's this kind of process towards empathic connection. Or even on a non-human level, in the way that I work in sites, I'm hoping that people will leave with a more personal, direct connection to that place. And then hopefully that's sort of like the gateway drug to becoming a better steward of that space, or if not that space, the public park or public lands that are nearest you. So there's this way in which I think art is about connectivity. So we have to start with our senses and ourself. And then that I sort of envision it as like these concentric rings. There's this like senses and the self, And then we ripple out to like, oh, I'm in a place. Where am I? Okay, now I'm in this place. Oh, look, there's other people in this place. And then those ripples just extend outward. So ultimately it's this interconnectivity with the world, like that point of self, and then expands outwards. Like those ripples when you throw a rock in a pond and you see its ripples extend. It starts from a center point and ripples out.
Yeah. Yeah. And that model works for me. And and maybe you captured this, but when you first mentioned the word empathy, it also occurred to me that just by directly and vividly portraying other people's experiences, it's maybe even a shortcut to that empathy piece.
Mm.
That rather than, maybe there's multiple pathways. One is that I'm attuned to what I'm experiencing this moment, the senses, the emotions, the mental states. But when I see someone else's experience so vividly portrayed, I can relate in a way that I would never think to relate or have access to relate otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, these are the powers of stories. Yeah.
Yeah.
Stories we tell about ourselves, the stories, as you're saying, that we become aware of through listening and witnessing stories that are not our own or that we're not familiar with. It's certainly one of the reasons that one of many reasons that I'm so interested in and devoted to Shakespeare, is that he gives us through his canon, gives us access to this massive range of human experience.
Yeah.
And that's just this like infinite well to draw from, and also just happens to, be an exquisite poet and portray those experiences in such a profound and personal way, very deeply human way. I mean, Shakespeare was not really meant to be read on the page. It was meant to be spoken and meant to be lived in the body and experienced through listening and through speaking. We've talked already a little bit about, or I was thinking a moment ago about something you said, and how that a lot of what we're talking around is true both for the maker and the recipient, albeit differently. So not everybody needs to be a making artist to connect with their creativity and receive the tremendous benefits of having a creative practice or having a meaningful relationship with art, and that it is about training us how to see and participate in the world, so that the application may not be for an audience member, may not be that their creative application of what they experience in the work may not look anything like art, but that the ways that we're learning to pay attention apply across disciplines and experiences, and I think just help enrich one's daily life when we participate in that kind of really attentive way to our sensory experience and to our physical environment.
Yeah, and that's so clear with the example of the eagles that you gave, right?
Yeah.
To be able to look up and see those eagles. But okay, so I'd like to root us a little bit more in the details of your performances, or the tradition that, I don't know if you're part of it or you created it, but just more of them, to give our listeners a sense of how what you do is different than what we typically think of as theater.
Yeah, well, there's no stage and there's no seats, so that's
okay. So imagine the theater performance.
So
first step, we take away the stage, and then we take away the seats.
It's funny. You started early on in our conversation. You used the phrase "all the world's a stage," which is of course Shakespeare's "As You Like It," and if I really take that to heart. I really, really believe it. All the world is a stage. And so the way that I tend to stage things is that whatever the site is that we're working in is the stage. And so each location defines how we move through that space. So if that's Alcatraz Island, you're taking a boat to get to the island, and then you're moving around the island throughout the performance. If it's Fort Point, which is the Civil War fortress under the Golden Gate Bridge, you're not moving that same kind of distance as you would on an island, but there's 4 stories of brick fortress, and you're moving up and down the stairs and up and down the levels. Sometimes there are much more intimate performances, like I referenced Mother Lear, which actually is built to be done in a variety of locations. And that could be someone's living room or a backyard or an elder care facility or a high school. And in that case, there's a more sort of traditional environment, but we bring the audience very, very close. So in the large scale performances, the audience is on their feet, they're following the show as it moves throughout a landscape. Often there are little foam kneelers or folding stools that audience members will carry with them. So there are seats, but they're portable. Some people will choose to stand. One thing that's really great about standing is you can choose and change your perspective throughout the performance. Things are being staged in such a way that you might be at the front row in one scene, and then you hear a trumpet behind you and you turn, and now the back of the audience becomes the front of the audience, and so on. So structurally, that's how it's rather different. You don't come into a lobby and then sit in a dark theater and sit in a chair. You're on your feet and you're moving. So there's this very kinesthetic experience. It's very rigorous and somewhat demanding for the audience members, because you don't necessarily get to sit back and wait for the art to come at you. I sort of, you got to work for your art. Sometimes we're in environments that are, whatever the actors are experiencing in terms of weather, the audience is too. So some of these sites can be very cold and windy and wet when you're under the Golden Gate Bridge. Sometimes when we were at Petaluma Adobe, which is an old adobe fort in Petaluma, California, that was scorching hot during the day and then dropped suddenly at night. So the audience is having this very, just because of the environment, this very visceral and kinesthetic experience of the space. But even in the smaller scale works that we're not moving through such a dramatic landscape or distance, that are more like chamber pieces, we bring the audience very, very, very close to us. And often lights are on or things are done in natural light. So there's this aspect of witnessing and witnessing the work, and also witnessing other people witness the work. So it's not necessarily that you're interacting with other audience members aside from moving together, but we'll often be in circles where you can see each other seeing the work. So there's these ways in which there's, even in the more traditional environments where audience are in chairs in a set or contained space, that we try to still create that real visceral, intimate sense. And the other thing is just a real heightened interest in engaging all of the senses, so that we're not just listening to the words and watching the actors, but that we're also, really feeling the experience with our bodies, because we're moving through the space. And the taste is usually involved. There's usually some food element, which is both about bringing in that sense, but it's also about, I think that art, like sharing meals, can be a great leveler, that when we break bread together and we share that, it's a very communal experience. And I think art can be a very communal experience. And so there's often a food element. So those are some of the ways that the work is maybe a little different than what folks might be used to going to a traditional theater.
Yeah. So kind of keywords I'm getting are sensory immersion, and you got to work for your art. You got to really demanding participation.
Yeah. And I'm definitely, I don't wish to do things to kind of get a rise out of people. It's funny. I'm actually like the first person to kind of like hide if someone on stage calls for a volunteer. So I really want to kind of create opportunities to engage at people's comfort level, but that the most basic level of participation is fairly easy. You have to physically move or whatever. That there are often in different shows opportunities to choose a more intense level of engagement. One example is when we did the Odyssey on Angel Island, you met Zeus at a crossroads and he gave you one of 3 directions to go. And like life, you could only go one direction and not the other 2. And so one of those directions involved sprinting and running through an obstacle course, and another direction involved going to this indoor space and being anointed and sung to by Athena's sacred priestesses. So 2 very different experiences that people could choose. So there's certainly an opportunity for choice and changing perspective within that. My other hope is to create these opportunities for engagement that where there isn't a scary moment of having to decide to participate, like what happens to me when someone asks for a volunteer and I don't want to be seen. I want to kind of create a way for people to participate sort of without having to they just sort of find themselves doing it, like, oh, and now we're all dancing, or now we're all feasting, or so that it's a little bit more organic. And I don't want to push people outside of their comfort zone. I want to coax them out of their comfort zone and gently nudge them. But I don't want to kind of force people to participate beyond their comfort level.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that crossroads thing, because it seems like that would inevitably end up building community, because at the end of the story, you'd want to talk to the other people who did the other choices and be like, well, what happened? What happened down that other pathway?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Beautiful. Um, I was interested in, I mean, there's just a million things, but would you like to speak a little bit more about Mother Lear, or kind of the connection between King Lear and Mother Lear?
Yeah, sure. We started talking about the salmon and the journey towards death, and it's one that we're all on. And I think, I've had a number of, I've lost a number of young people in my life. And I have found each time that has happened, that there's, in this kind of heightened state of grief, I've also found some of my most, I guess, just most sincere access to real compassion, because I'm so aware of the weight that I'm carrying in those extreme, or that acute phase of loss.
Mm.
And I'm aware that when I go to buy a coffee or whatever normal thing, doing normal things is so bizarre and surreal when you're in that acute stage of grief for me. And, paying the gas station attendant, it's like so weird because it's such a normal thing to do. And this person has no idea, nor should they know. And yet I'm so consumed by that feeling. And so in that acute state, I've often found a lot of access to compassion, because it makes me wonder, well, what is that person who's serving me my coffee, or who's the gas station attendant, or whatever thing, what invisible weight are they carrying? And then I start looking around and I'm like, what invisible stories are we all carrying, that we aren't talking about? And so I think it's sort of that, combined with my own grandmother, who was like another mother to me growing up, had dementia for 10 years, and she lost language entirely. And it was like, if it wasn't such a, intensely sad and hard process, there's something really fascinating about it, where she lost English first and still had Italian, which was her first language. And then she lost Italian, but still had swear words, which was kind of amazing and hysterical. We're like, once in a while, she'd come out with something really clear and it would be like, a curse.
Wow.
And then even after she lost that, she still had music, and she couldn't make the words anymore, but she would sing, and my mother would sing to her, and she'd come along, she'd sing along to the tune as best she could. And so she was a big inspiration for doing this piece, Mother Lear, because I think that the things that started to come up was just realizing how we're all walking around with these invisible stories and grief, and it's this huge missed opportunity for connection and compassion. We all think we're so different because we vote differently, or we live differently, or we whatever differently. We all think we're so different, but we have this thing that we all share, that no matter how different we think we are, death is inevitable, and it's something that we could actually find a place of connection. But again, it's not something that there's a lot of, culturally safe spaces to talk about it or whatever. And so as I started building Mother Lear, which I co-created with my collaborator, Courtney Walsh, who plays Mother Lear, who's tremendous, we, in the process, did a number of workshops. We were able to go to the Zen Hospice Center in San Francisco and do some workshops there, and learn a lot from different palliative care and hospice care nurses, and just be so inspired. I mean, your podcast is called 10,000 Heroes. And if I can think of the people who are most heroic to me at this stage in my life, it's all of those, not just healthcare providers, but specifically people working with terminally ill folks, or working in palliative care and hospice care. And they're just so truly, truly heroic in what they do and how they do it. That the piece really became, something that was like, and again, that was why Act 2, the conversation that we structure it that way, as Act 1 and Act 2, and not a post-show conversation, that it's like not optional. Of course, people leave, if they wish to or whatever, but it's not like the post-show discussion. We actually get in a circle. Often we've had facilitators who work in healthcare to kind of be a part of that. It's not a Q&A like, actors sitting on one side and the audience over on the other. We really try to make that an integrated part of the experience. And, I guess, as I mentioned a moment ago with Shakespeare, that it's like everything, to me, pretty much any topic you want to get at, any aspect of human experience that you want to get at, there's something in Shakespeare that can be useful, fruitful for that exploration. And King Lear is very much a play. The full play is about this aging father. If we strip away some of the other complexities of the plot, it's about this aging man who may or may not be suffering some form of dementia. He's making bizarre choices at this stage in his life, like giving away his kingdom to his daughters in this very bizarre way, which I don't need to get into all the ins and outs of the plot, but that he has 3 daughters, and one of them, Cordelia, really is the one who loves him, but she's also the one who won't play stupid games. She will tell him the truth, and unfortunately, that is a huge part of the tragedy, that he's so wrapped up in his own pride and ego, which is actually also something we see in the play Mother Lear, that this woman, Mother Lear, is so wrapped up in her pride and her ego, which understandably is so hard for us to let go of. It's hard for us to let go of our personality, if not impossible, our identity, our sense of self, that we're so afraid that if we let go of who we think we are, that we won't exist anymore. Rather than, what you focus on is actually transformation, that when that self dies, another self can be born. But there's that fear. Transformation is messy and unpredictable, and we don't know what's going to happen. So there's many ways in which our Mother Lear does reflect some of the qualities of King Lear. But in this story, like my grandmother who lost English but had Italian, Mother Lear has lost language, and the only language she has left is the text of King Lear. And so the challenge becomes, how does her daughter communicate with her when the only language that her mother has is King Lear? And so with Courtney and I, as we developed the piece, some of that grew out of improv games and experiments where we'd play out the scene, and I, as the daughter, I actually play the daughter in the piece, would play different roles to kind of find that point of connection, which actually comes back to kind of what we've been talking about throughout, is like seeking connection, that they're seeking connection. How can they connect? And that the moments when they fail to connect is when the daughter insists on her mother joining her reality. The moments when they succeed in connecting is when the daughter lets go of her own agenda, her own need, and meets her mother in her mother's reality, however weird and bizarre and unlike, the quote unquote normal reality that we all share is. And that's been something that we've also learned a lot from these healthcare providers who've become our teachers through the process of making it, where that's so true, that oftentimes it's very, very hard for the people who are closest to do that, to make that leap, to play the improv game, yes and, because we want our parent to still be our parent, or we want our person to still be who they are, and we can't let them be who they are. We're trying to keep them who they were rather than let them be who they are. And so in Mother Lear, we see this played out where when Cordelia, the daughter, can let her mother be as she is and meet her where she's at, they succeed in having some sort of connection. And when Cordelia can't do that, they fail. And sometimes she needs to, right? Like as a parent, sometimes you're a parent, sometimes, you succeed and have the most joy when you say yes and you play the imagination game your daughter wants to play. But sometimes she does have to not touch the stove because it's hot, or she does have to put her raincoat on because it's pouring outside. So there are these places where the ideal butts up against reality, and for someone's safety or whatever, we have to push our own agenda. But these are the complexities of interacting that we see in this kind of hyper concentrated way in Mother Lear. So I've talked more about Mother Lear than I think the Shakespeare King Lear than you wanted me to, but that's what came.
Yeah, no, it's so beautiful, and it really just set me. I had to like force myself to return to what you're saying, because as soon as you were talking about accepting, your parents for who they are as they change. I just immediately go to my parents. You're like, how successful am I in doing that? And thinking about like, these are the moments I connect to them is when I'm able to do that. And it reminds me of on the first episode of this podcast, there's this guy, Uncle Jamal, Brother Jamal. He's a Sufi imam. And he talked about this pattern. He calls it 3 cups of tea of how to connect with anyone. And it starts with listening. That's the first cup of tea. And the second is really holding a respect for their reality and their words, even if they're different than how we think or how we say things, but just carving out the space for mutual coexistence and not being threatened by the fact that their reality is different than our own. And I think this applies as well to strangers or people who vote differently, to your own parents. And the third is to actually, once that's laid out there, then we have the possibility of actually connecting and finding something shared that is meaningful and essential to us both. And of course, we've been talking all day about death, and that's something that we, as you said, we can all connect over that. We can all connect. I mean, everything that Buddha was talking about, really, we can all connect over sickness. We can all connect over loss. We can all connect over uncertainty. We can all connect over death, because that's just part of our destiny.
Yeah. That story that you just said, or that you just shared about the Imam, inspires a couple of things. One, the poem that I read at the end of, I teach yoga, and at the end of today's practice, I read this poem that I happen to have in front of me and is so connected to that story of 3 cups of tea. It's short. May I recite it for you?
Oh, I want you to read all kinds of things. So let's start with that.
Okay. So it's called Red Brocade, and it's by Naomi Shihab Nye. I hope that's how you pronounce her name. She's a living poet, contemporary. And she says, "The Arabs used to say, when a stranger appears at your door, feed him for 3 days before asking who he is, where he's come from, where he's headed. That way, he'll have the strength enough to answer. Or by then, you'll be such good friends you don't care. Let's go back to that. Rice? Pine nuts? Here, take the red brocade pillow. My child will serve water to your horse. No, I was not busy when you came. I was not preparing to be busy. That's the armor everyone put on to pretend they had a purpose in this world. I refuse to be claimed. Your plate is waiting. We will snip fresh mint into your tea."
Goosebumps.
So that's fun that you shared that story. It reminded me of that poem, which was on the tip of my tongue just moments ago. And the other thing that you said in there about then after the second cup of tea, there's the possibility, the space is created for the possibility of connection. And then we might actually be able to hear what each other is saying. And that also makes me think of, sort of what's at play when we use the text of King Lear to write this new play that is a new play, but is recycled from this other language, is the phenomenon of words, that you can make a word mean almost anything. And that's an actor's job, right? That you can say yes in 10,000 different ways. You can say no in 10,000 different ways. That part of what Shakespeare's so brilliant at is that when you follow the impact of the words. So he might write, I love you not. So in the moment that he says love, you love, and that it changes when he says not. But that these words, that because of inflection, tone, quality, intent, where we're looking, where we're not looking, our body language can mean so many different things. And I learned a long time ago this game from a former teacher of mine, John Haddon, who I learned this from him, and I use it as part of my audition practice now, which is a circle of people, and actors bring in their monologues, but instead of each actor doing their monologue, one at a time, speaking to the wall behind the casting director's head or whatever, that we all get in a circle, and that each actor enters the circle. One actor enters the circle and starts their monologue. And then a second actor enters and interrupts them using the text of their monologue. And then they interact in the circle using only the text of their monologue. And the goal is not to be clever and try to pick the right part from later in the monologue, but to just do the monologue straight through from top to bottom. And if you forget where you are, go back to the beginning and just do it straight through, but use the words to mean what you need them to mean in that moment to have an interaction with this other person in the circle. So it works on a lot of levels. We have to let go of our fancy way that we kneel on this line and we gesture on this line and all those things. And I get to see when two people are doing this. Are they generous? Do they listen? How do they play? Those kinds of things. But that it's really amazing that these things happen within the circle where suddenly these words that mean something. I mean, one thing in the context of the play can mean something totally different in this altered context of these two people interacting. So there's just something you said about, the words, and that just words can mean so many different things, and that it's kind of a miracle we ever understand anything each other says. And so I think earlier when we were talking about awareness and paying attention, I'm reminded that, that I'm hoping that through all this, I'm also learning to listen more closely to spaces, to people, but also to non-human things, to the way, like we started talking about the salmon, like what is that salmon saying? Not because I'm anthropomorphizing it, but because what can I, using my human skill of meaning making and metaphor, hear in that. What is that salmon story when it's leaping uphill? Or what is that eagle's story when it's sitting perfectly still watching on the top of the tree? What are the ways that a place, I referenced a few of the locations we've worked in, like Alcatraz, is a great example of a place that holds stories in its stones, and we are familiar with the prison history, but there's a longer history than just the prison history, a really important Native American occupation of the island during the civil rights movement in the 60s. And what are the ways that stones hold memories, that trees hold memories, that we as humans need to learn to listen in different ways in order to extract those stories and those meanings that are there? That's really of interest to me. How do we learn to see with new eyes, to listen in new ways?
Yeah, how do we deepen our listening? I mean, it's so powerful. So I have this math and computer science background. And so you talk about communication. I think of it as like there's an encryption model where there's a feeling, there's a sentiment in someone's heart or someone's mind. They do their best with the language skills they have, and that may be different for different people and depending on which context and which country and which language they're in. But we try to translate that feeling into words. So that's the encryption. And then they send that along the wire out into the air, these vibrations then hit the ears of this other person. And there's this whole other level of like whether their hearing works or not, but skip past that. Then that person decrypts those words using what those words mean to them, not to the original speaker, and tries to get a sense of the feeling out of it. And sometimes there's a lot of errors in that process, like the message is corrupted. And sometimes it comes across pretty well, but it's pretty remarkable with anything subtle or meaningful, or if you have like mixed emotions, anything about love or death or jealousy or purpose, that we would actually get it right, especially if we were only listening to words and not all of the other meaning-making cues that it given us in the tone and the body and the posture and the pauses. And I feel like when I'm really listening, I'm almost getting more information from those cues than I am from the words themselves.
Yeah, totally.
So as we
in the spaces in between, I'm so interested in the spaces in between, as you're saying, the spaces in between words, what's not being said, how it's being said, but also, the spaces in between in terms of other forms of perception, like what was here, what will be here, what might be here. A lot of times, especially our eyes, they work almost too well, those of us that are sighted, that we're bombarded by visual stimulation all the time. And it can really dominate. And I think we forget to look at places and say, like we take the present as if it's always been that way. Or too often we do a certain
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
but to actually say, well, what was here and what will be here and what might be here, is really hard. It's really important. It's and also I've been finding, I've been really surprised and excited about just some of the things that I use in my theater making practice, some of the stuff around sensory awareness stuff, in building relationship to place, getting a character in the body or finding the character from the inside out, sometimes from the outside in because of the way a space will dominate or inform an actor's movement or physicality. But I started teaching at California College of the Arts a couple years ago in an interdisciplinary capacity. And basically with this kind of hypothesis that some of these practices would be useful across design disciplines. As I was speaking to before, like you don't need to be a theater maker to use these things and benefit from them. And so I sort of had the opportunity with a wonderful colleague and co-teacher, Shalini Agrawal, who's an architect, where we come from very different backgrounds. And I come from a sort of very somatic-based research, and she comes from a very different, more traditional architecture design based practice. But with this hypothesis that some of these practices of paying attention and different sensory awareness stuff, and also just different games, that you almost look like children's games, would be useful across design disciplines. And I have been so amazed and thrilled that not only has that so far proved true, and our students are not performers, they're graphic design students and filmmakers and illustrators and architects and very different design practices. But one of the things I've been most impressed with is the power of closing your eyes. That that just taking away, if you are sighted, just taking away that dominant sense can be very disorienting, but after just a little bit of time really can bring you into a heightened experience of other senses. And you spoke a little bit to sensory deprivation. And even in a non-extreme way, I've been really impressed with how in a non-extreme way, not going into the wilderness for weeks on end or doing without or sensory deprivation tank, but literally just closing your eyes for 3 minutes can be really profound. Or, conscientiously changing your aperture, trying to do a soft focus and see everything at once without seeing anything in particular, and then consciously shift to sharp focus and trying to see one thing at a time. And there've been so many stories that are small in the recounting, but were massive in the moment within class, of somebody spending some time like Thoreau with this ant on the ground, and that ant ended up leading this student into this really profound memory journey of their childhood, which gave them access to a sensory memory that they hadn't had since they were a little kid, which brought them joy and brought them ease, which I think we also underestimate that power. A lot of us, for whatever reason, we live in a stressful world. We have stressful jobs. It's stressful to be a parent and, have a full-time job, but whatever combination of things, that I think sometimes we underestimate the power of play and the power of those small shifts that allow us to see differently. To use our imagination. I mean, our imagination is like our number one tool, and we've got to find ways to exercise it.
Totally. Okay, so I want to get you to refine that a little bit, because one thing I like to do with each episode is to hand out like a little gift to the audience, and sometimes it's just an exercise of something that they took it seriously, really transform their life. So that's it. But can you distill that into like a homework assignment for the audience?
Oh, fun. Yeah. Cool. Well, one homework assignment is to literally do just that. Just close your eyes, set a timer so that you won't think about it. Because also time dilates in a weird way when you're without that dominant sense. So pick an amount of time, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever. 2 minutes will feel like a long time. Set a timer, close your eyes, and actively tune in to what's the farthest thing you can hear. What's the closest thing you can hear? What do you smell? How far can you reach your sense of smell? Can you reach beyond that? And to basically go through that through your non-dominant senses. And then when you bring your eyes back, intentionally drop your head so that you're looking at yourself on the floor first, and just slowly, softly open your eyes and try to allow a soft focus. Interpret that how you will. And then let your sight gradually come back in. So that's just a super simple sensory scan that can calm you down, slow you down, and often bring discoveries as well. You suddenly realize, oh, the closest thing is that I can hear is my own heartbeat, or my own thoughts, or the farthest thing is much further than you thought it would be. So that's a simple one.
Lovely. Thank you. And I just like to, I would love to hear what people do. So we do, I'm still figuring out how to use it, but we do have a Twitter account. It's called 10,000 Heroes Pod, because I think 10,000 Heroes Podcast was too long. So 10,000 Heroes Pod, I would love, if anyone does that, I'd love to hear what happens, what you discover, and then I'll share it with you, Ava.
Cool. Yes, please.
Yeah. Another question that I would just love, this is another gift, really. I'd say this is a gift for the audience. I've heard you do different voices for how you read Shakespeare. There's like an old, staid, kind of stentorian version, and then there's like a more organic version. Could you pick a passage, do a couple different voices, and tell me why? Why did you do one and not the other?
Sure. Sure. Let's see what is coming to mind. Let's see. Here's one everyone knows. It's Undiscovered Country is a line that I spoke earlier. That's from To Be or Not to Be. People know that speech. The voice that I might be lovingly mocking is the sort of Shakespearean performance voice, which might be something like, to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer, this kind of thing, versus just speaking the text. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them to die. To sleep, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. It is a consummation devoutly to be wished to die. It's like, which one are you listening to, right? Are you listening to my voice, or are you listening to the words? I think in one you're listening to the words, and in the other you're listening to my voice roll around. There's obviously less extreme versions of that, but there's still this kind of actor voice that we sometimes have to be careful of. Feels like we're doing something when we use our actor voice, and I've used an exaggerated one.
You made that point very, very clearly for me. Thank you.
But I think it's just know what you're saying, mean what you're saying, find a personal connection to what you're saying, and then just say it. Easier said than done. Sounds easy, but therein lies the rub.
Wow. I that was perfect.
Well, how about I give you one more little bit of text? That's actually from King Lear. Since
please.
So much about King Lear.
Yeah, what a gift.
And that will feel like, because I didn't finish To Be or Not to Be, and it's long, and this one's short. And it feels like a way of honoring some of what we've talked about, because I think that this speech, it's one of the last things that Lear says. He says it to Cordelia. They've been captured, and they're going to be likely put to death. Side note, by Cordelia's Lear's other two daughters and Cordelia's sisters. So it's a very tragic situation.
Gnarly.
Yeah. But they've had this reconciliation, Lear and Cordelia. And Cordelia says something about how, well, enough context. Lear says to her, "Come, let's away to prison. We two alone will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. So we'll live and pray and sing and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies and hear poor rogues talk of court news, and we'll talk with them too, who loses and who wins, who's in, who's out, and take upon us the mystery of things as if we were God's spies. And we'll wear out in a walled prison packs and sects of great ones that ebb and flow by the moon. I just think that speech is so beautiful, but also important. He says, when thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. And this way in which he says, yeah, let's away to prison. You know, that our oppressors think they've got us. But if our hearts are free, if our love is here, then we're the ones who are truly free. And while they're all out there talking of court news and gossiping and blah, 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 who wins, who loses, we're going to let go of all that stuff and take upon us the mystery of things as if we were God's spies. I feel like that's just such a nice thing to come back to and remember that we can, in whatever, Hamlet says it another way, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. But if we're having good dreams inside that little nutshell, then it feels like it's a vast space. So I guess that's maybe part of what I'm trying to explore and do is like, how do we cultivate presence? And how does that presence bring us into a greater state of grace?
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much. I mean, for everything, but for those two passages, it's just so beautiful to be arrested by those words and brought to life. One last question, and this may be like totally anathema to you or impossible given how you do your work. But for those of us who are not where you're performing these things, is there any way we can experience it? Is there any way we can hear an audio version or a video or just some kind of version of Mother Lear or some of these other productions you've done?
Yeah, actually. Most of it is, very much designed to be these like unrepeatable events that happen and are ephemeral and all of that. And that's a big part of it, is that it gets wiped away. Kind of like a sand mandala. We pour all this energy in and then we just swish it away. People take a bit of it with them. But because of the pandemic, we started experimenting with other mediums. And so last year, we actually put out 2 audio programs. We were in the process of building our big 20th anniversary production that was going to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Golden Gate Park with a production called What Alice Found There, which is an adaptation of the Alice in Wonderland stories. And that was sadly canceled because of the pandemic, but we had all of the actors narrated all 24 chapters of both books through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland. So that's available for free on our website. You can download it as a podcast or you can listen to it on the website. So that's available. And then also in 2011, we did a sailing production of the Odyssey aboard a 150-year-old scow schooner. And we recorded that as well. So there's 5 episodes of that, which is an Odyssey audio drama. And then we also made a film adaptation of our Caesar Maximus, which was an adaptation of Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, that was staged at the music concourse in Golden Gate Park. And that's a short 30-minute film that's available on our website. And we're exploring some other film things coming up soon. So if people are interested, they can go to weplayers.org, weplayers.org, and check out our portfolio, check out some of those audio opportunities. And if folks are interested, certainly can join the mailing list and find out where we're going to be next. Mother Lear does travel, so that's a piece that we expect to be taking to other communities outside of the Bay Area. And also our future film and audio works will be available on our website as well. So those are some ways.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm happy to hear that that's possible. I really hope that there's some way personally that I could see this Mother Lear. It just sounds amazing.
Yay. Yeah, I hope so too. I would love to share it with you.
All right, folks, thanks so much for listening. That was Ava Roy, and you can check out the show notes for some information about her theater pieces for projects she's got coming up. And thank you to Encore for a wonderful interview.